Hi, my name is Taylor. I'm a product designer with the ID Group, and here's a walkthrough of my latest UX scorecard for Workspaces. So the process for this scorecard was to observe 5 participants using our Workspace feature to complete a code author task, and it resulted in a UX scorecard issue as well as recommendations. So I'll link to those in the description. So the task overview that users went through was essentially trying to mimic what a code author would do. So you get assigned an issue, you set up your environment, write some code, verify that those changes were what you expected, and then create an MR to get that merged into the application and finish up by terminating your environment. So some of the highlights: benchmark score C, so that's an average. I gave it this rating just because there were some struggles at certain points, especially with launching the workspace. But once users got that done, it was pretty smooth sailing, as a lot of the tasks followed the same patterns that they're used to with their local environment. Top highlight: people could definitely see the value in it. One of the comments was, "This is definitely the future," which is great feedback to get. Some top areas of opportunity: again, launching the workspace, and that's connected to our documentation. The documentations doesn't really address the needs of our code author persona. It's a little bit more focused on admins. And also, users don't fully grasp the difference between the Web ID and Web ID when used with workspaces. So for the first step of the task was creating a workspace. So first, users started by exploring the UI. They searched throughout the project UI, but they very quickly ended up looking to documentation. A lot of people, this is a little small, but on our project sidebar, this was an area that users often look to first. Under code was mentioned by some people as being an expected area. The edit button and the code button were also looked at, but they were less common. And sometimes even after opening the edit button, they still miss the workspaces, and maybe because it's at the bottom of the list, but they sometimes even clicked on Git pod. One thing that did confuse users as well was if they did start a workspace from the edit button, it directs them to your work instead of it takes them on the project. And that gave them the impression that the tab had suddenly appeared, and they were a little bit confused by that. So users who went to the docs pretty much all started their search via Google. And then once they landed on either documentation or often our quick start guide on our blog, they started scanning for keywords. And since a lot of the information was focused on the admin persona, they got the impression that they had to either have Docker installed or set up a Kubernetes cluster. And this was because some of the headlines use things like create workspace. And so they thought, I'm trying to create a workspace, I'll just quickly follow these directions. So if participants found the answer they were looking to in the docs, they then followed the instructions, which guided users to open the search bar in the top left of our nav and then select your work. This wasn't super intuitive to people, and some comments were like, this was not what they expected for launching a workspace. And this definitely adds some extra friction because the user then has to navigate back to the project. Some of the alternative methods that people used, Duo Chat was one. You can see here's an example of the person running a query to Duo Chat. Duo Chat then gives them the actual correct response from the documentation, but then we had a bug where the response disappeared and they ended up going back to Google. People also hypothesized, okay, maybe they could launch this from the Web ID. That's a logical conclusion because it's an environment that you use with Web ID. Why couldn't they do the reverse and launch it from there as well? Control F was another method, and then searching for workspace, but that was unsuccessful. So the users who navigated via the search bar and followed the documentation directions were slower to complete the task because the project itself on the Create Workspace page does not get pre-filled. So if you navigate through your work, you then have to manually select the project. And for users who did that, they sometimes didn't fully understand what appeared in this list. For example, they wondered, one participant wondered, like, is this all the projects that they have access to, or is this a list of projects that are enabled to work with workspaces? That was just a little bit unclear, but if they launched via the edit button, this was pre-filled for them, no problem. users pretty much kept to defaults and didn't fully understand what the dev files relationship was to a workspace. After some users investigated this and they were able to hypothesize correctly, but they still had a lot of questions about what it is and how it relates. All right, so now we're on to ideas for improving the task of creating a workspace. Documentation would be a great place to start. So right now our documentation focuses on the admin persona. Let's maybe consider the end user as well, and things like quick start guides, maybe revisiting some of the headings that we're using, such as create a workspace. This is something that might be interpreted differently by an end user. Providing more directions that aren't just opening a workspace from your work, perhaps also opening it from the project level, and things like walkthrough tutorial videos, blog guides, those will definitely be helpful. So also consider revisiting how we present it on the project page. Users are having a hard time discovering it. We've already got one issue in progress, which places it under the code dropdown. I think this would definitely be more likely to be discovered as a user is exploring, because this is how one of their typical entry points into setting up their environment. But another way is potentially we have a dedicated button. The other idea could be, why not make it easier to launch a workspace directly from the web ID? So we've got this empty state right now that informs the user on configuring a remote connection, but it's very generic and it leaves a lot of the burden on the user. Could be allow you to launch with one button click. That would be really cool. So the next task was actually launching the workspace after they created it. So everyone was able to figure out how to open it. They clicked the preview link on the workspace list, but even though they clicked it, that didn't mean they fully understood what was happening. For example, the web ID launches. One of the questions was, is this the same web ID I launched previously in the repository? It looks different, it has a different theme, it behaves a little bit differently. That's confusing to users. Also, the term preview was not what they expected. The terminology made their expectation of how it connected with the web ID just added some confusion. Some weren't even sure if they were actually in the sandbox, or if it was some sort of preview environment. So one idea is just revisit that preview column. This is an existing issue, but perhaps something like a button or something that follows a pattern more akin to launching, and maybe changing the word away from previewing. Also, we have this issue for the web ID should behave and look the same, whether it's launched from a workspace or without a workspace. That just aligns with users' expectations, and it's a little bit confusing to them as to when it's different, why it's different. So the next task would be setting up the environment. So there's definitely a gap between users who have used VS Code and those who are unfamiliar with it. For example, something as simple as opening a terminal was quite a pretty big friction point for users who were not familiar with VS Code, and those who were familiar had absolutely no problem with it. So it's definitely one of the first places users and developers are going to, so perhaps we could open it by default. So why not just have it open by default and let the user close it if they need to, but because it's such a key part of the workflow, it's more likely that they will need it than not, and it helps provide some useful context as to whether they have an environment set up or not. So the next task would be previewing their changes. So this was something where the README on the demo project that they were using had instructions on how to complete it, and without those instructions, it would have been very difficult for them to figure it out. So part of the challenge was the port is handled where it's handled in the URL. Users tended to expect it to be near the end, and they basically were unsure how to discover that without having actual instructions. And right now the process is you manually copy and paste that URL, open a new tab, change the port to say port 3000 after you're running your dev server, and then that will load in the sandbox. So idea, maybe we could provide some more guidance. Not sure if this is feasible, but why not just provide a direct link in the terminal or instructions? This is how you access your dev server, or this is where the port is in this URL. It would, I think, just mitigate a lot of confusion or digging around in docs. Task for committing code changes. So users, especially those not familiar with VS Code, prefer to use the terminal and just their standard Git workflow. But one thing that this was from people who are not familiar with VS Code is they had some trouble figuring out what branch they were on, and they couldn't quite remember always the Git commands because they're used to having these quality of life features in their local IDs that auto-suggest or show the branch that they're on. So some of the comments, I'd expect to be able to hit tab and have it filled in like my local ID. I don't always remember all the commands. So some ideas, just we've got an epic with a bunch of issues that will improve the Git workflow. So maybe there's this pretty much is all going to have value to the user. Another potential idea is, could we show the branch in the terminal so users are less likely to miss it? So last task, opening up the MR. So users prefer to open the MR in the same context that they're working. Pretty much every user first looked within the web IE trying to figure out if they could do it. All of them ended up switching to the GitLab UI. They had no problem using the UI, but it's just a nice quality of life to match sort of how it works in the web ID. You can see we show a pop-up after a commit, and it allows the user to create an MR directly from here. And actually, this is the last task, terminating the workspace. So everyone was able to terminate it, but they often stopped it first and didn't fully understand that there was a difference between stopping and terminating. One of the suggestions was to use the terminology delete instead of terminate. All right, so here's just some miscellaneous quotes and thoughts to wrap this up. So what is a workspace? Users don't fully understand the workspace feature and don't have a strong mental model about how it relates to the rest of GitLab, and especially how it relates to the web ID and projects. So I'm not going to read all these quotes, but just a few highlights. People thought it would be some people thought it would be a broader feature. So like Workspace suggests this is where I work, and when I'm working, they're not working all on just a specific project. And so they thought it would be broader and more expansive than just tied to a specific project. And some of the confusion, even after they had completed the task, is like, what are the differences with the web ID? It just wasn't clear to them. So they had a general sense of workspaces are being used as a remote development environment, but do they have to use it with the web ID, for example? That's something that was a little bit confusing. So a few suggestions a guide. So even the first time you use a workspace, it pops up and it gives them a walkthrough. Some users expected to be able to view the logs of the container just to help them understand how it worked and trust it a bit more. Another suggestion was being able to see other members in the project's workspaces, because that would boost collaboration, and it was something that was expressed as being potentially useful. And also just having it in the side nav at the project level, was definitely a place where users expected to see it, especially since that's where it appeared in the your work level. And there's also desire to be able to launch it in different editors and not just VS Code. So next steps, I've got a UX scorecard recommendations issue that summarizes and collects all the related issues for each task and ways to improve that. And just wanted to round it out with like, this is the future. Like, people definitely see the value in this, and they were optimistic and interested in the feature. So that's great news. So thanks for watching.